The disaster at Slapton Sands, how friendly fire killed more than D-Day's beach landings. At 130 hours, on April 28, 1944, aboard LST-57 in Lyme Bay, off the coast of Devon, England, Ensign John Doyle heard the first explosion. He was standing watch on the bridge when the torpedo hit amidships on the starboard side. The blast tore through the tank deck where 400 soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division were sleeping. The ship shuddered, listed immediately to starboard, and men started screaming. Doyle had no idea what had hit them. German E-boats, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes, had penetrated the exercise area. 9 German vessels had slipped past British coastal defenses, past the destroyer HMS Azalea that was supposed to be protecting the convoy, past every warning system the Allied command had established to prevent exactly this scenario. But the Germans weren't the only ones who would kill Americans that night. In the chaos that followed, more soldiers would die from friendly fire, from inadequate training, from equipment failures, and from command decisions made weeks earlier that guaranteed catastrophe. This was Exercise Tiger, the final full-scale rehearsal for D-Day landings at Utah Beach. It would kill 946 American servicemen, more than would die on Utah Beach itself. On June 6, the disaster would be covered up for decades. The lessons would be ignored, and the mistakes that caused it would be repeated. The operation that became Exercise Tiger began in January 1944 when General Dwight Eisenhower established his headquarters in London as Supreme Commander of Allied Expeditionary Forces. Eisenhower's mission was to plan and execute Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France. The target date was early June 1944, when tides and moon phases would be optimal. Eisenhower had approximately 156,000 troops to land on 5 beaches across a 50-mile front in Normandy. 2 beaches, Utah and Omaha, were assigned to American forces. 3 beaches, Gold, Juno, and Sword, were assigned to British and Canadian forces. The planning required coordination between American, British, and Canadian armies, air forces, and navies. Timing had to be precise. Communications had to be flawless. Equipment had to function exactly as designed. Nothing could be left to chance. Yet everything about amphibious assault was inherently chaotic. Soldiers had to transfer from transport ships to landing craft while underway. Landing craft had to navigate to shore in formation while under fire. Tanks had to drive off ramps into water and somehow reach the beach. Artillery had to be unloaded under combat conditions. Supplies had to flow continuously from ships offshore to troops advancing inland. The entire operation depended on thousands of individual actions being performed correctly by men who had never done them before, under the worst possible conditions. The only way to prepare was rehearsal. Full-scale exercises, using actual troops, actual ships, actual beaches that resembled Normandy as closely as possible. The British found the perfect location on the Devon coast. Slapton Sands was a 3-mile stretch of beach backed by a freshwater lake called Slapton Lay. The geography closely matched Utah Beach in Normandy, shingle and pebbles at the waterline, flat beach, shallow lagoon behind. The British government evacuated 3,000 civilians from the area in December 1943, requisitioning the land for military training. Entire villages were emptied. Families were given weeks to leave homes they'd occupied for generations. The evacuation was necessary and ruthless. By March 1944, the area around Slapton Sands had been converted into a military training zone. American forces began conducting small unit exercises. Company-level landings, battalion-level assaults, coordination drills between infantry and armor. The exercises grew larger through March and early April. By mid-April, planning was complete for Exercise Tiger, a full-scale corps-level rehearsal involving the entire Seven Corps, approximately 30,000 troops. The exercise would simulate the actual D-Day landing at Utah Beach. Ships would sail from ports in Devon, cross Lyme Bay, and land troops at Slapton Sands exactly as they would land at Utah Beach 6 weeks later. Naval gunfire would bombard the beach. Aircraft would provide air support. Tanks would land with infantry. Engineers would clear obstacles. The entire operation would run exactly as planned for June 6. Major General J. Lawton Collins commanded 7th Corps. Collins was 47 years old, West Point, class of 1917. He had served in World War I, spent the interwar years in various staff and command positions, and commanded the 25th Infantry Division at Guadalcanal in 1942-43. He was experienced, capable, and demanding. Collins understood that Exercise Tiger was critical. His troops had to execute the landing perfectly because there would be no second chance on D-Day. Any mistakes made during the exercise could be corrected. Mistakes made during the actual invasion would cost lives. The naval component of Exercise Tiger was commanded by Rear Admiral Don Moon. Moon was 51 years old, Naval Academy class of 1916. He had served in World War I, commanded destroyers between the wars, and taken command of naval forces for Utah Beach in February 1944. Moon was methodical and detail-oriented, perhaps too much so. He worried constantly about the complexity of amphibious operations. He understood how many things could go wrong. The Naval Task Force for Exercise Tiger consisted of 8 LSTs, landing ship tank large vessels designed to carry tanks and vehicles directly to beaches. Each LST was approximately 328 feet long, displaced 4,080 tons, fully loaded, and could carry 20 Sherman tanks or 40 trucks or equivalent cargo. The LSTs would be escorted by the British corvette HMS Azalea and several smaller patrol vessels. The convoy would depart Plymouth and Brixham on the evening of April 27th, sail overnight across Lime Bay, and arrive at Slapton Sands at dawn on April 28th. The timing was critical. The landing had to occur at 0730 hours to match the planned H hour for Utah Beach. Naval gunfire support would begin at 0600 hours. The cruiser HMS Hawkins and several destroyers would bombard the beach with live ammunition. The bombardment would end at 7:25 hours, 5 minutes before the first wave landed. The 5-minute gap was designed to match the gap expected on D-Day, when naval gunfire would lift and aircraft would strafe the beach immediately before troops landed. This was where the first critical error was made. The live fire exercise meant that ships would be firing directly over the landing craft as they approached the beach. If timing was off by even a few minutes, shells would land on American troops. The margin for error was 5 minutes across a distance of several thousand yards, with ships and landing craft all moving independently. It was an inherently dangerous plan. On April 22nd, during an earlier phase of Exercise Tiger, the danger became reality. At approximately 900 hours, American soldiers were advancing inland from Slapton Sands when naval gunfire support began. The bombardment was scheduled to hit targets 200 yards ahead of the troops. Instead, shells landed directly on American positions. The error was simple and catastrophic. The naval gunfire controller had confused map coordinates. He called fire on the wrong grid square. By the time the error was recognized and fire lifted, approximately 450 American soldiers were dead or wounded. The exact number was classified and remains uncertain. Bodies were collected, wounded were evacuated, and the exercise continued. General Collins was furious. He demanded a full investigation. Admiral Moon ordered immediate changes to fire control procedures. But the investigation revealed a deeper problem. Communication between shore-based controllers and ships offshore was inadequate. Radio procedures were inconsistent. Map coordinates were confusing. Training was insufficient. The problems were systemic, and there was no time to fix them before the next phase of Exercise Tiger, scheduled for April 27 to 28. The decision was made to proceed. The rationale was that D-Day was 6 weeks away. There was no time for delay. The troops needed experience with live fire. The risks were acceptable. This was the command failure that guaranteed disaster. Collins and Moon knew the communication systems were inadequate. They knew coordination between naval and ground forces was poor. They knew soldiers were insufficiently trained. They proceeded anyway because the schedule was more important than safety. On the evening of April 27th, the convoy assembled. 8 LSTs loaded with troops, vehicles, and equipment. LST-57, LST-531, LST-511, LST-496, LST-499, LST-518, LST-58, and LST-289. Each ship carried between 300 and 500 troops, mostly from the 4th Infantry Division, along with tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, and supplies. The men aboard were nervous. Many had never been to sea before. Most had never participated in an amphibious landing. They'd been briefed that this was an exercise, but the presence of live ammunition made it feel like combat. The LSTs departed Plymouth and Brixham between 1900 and 2100 hours. They formed a column and headed southwest into Lime Bay. Maximum speed was 8 knots, the speed of the slowest vessel. The escort was supposed to be 2 destroyers, HMS Scimitar and USS Satterley, but HMS Scimitars had been damaged in a collision earlier that day and was unavailable. USS Satterley was assigned to other duties. The only escort was HMS Azalea, a single corvette armed with depth charges and a 4-inch gun. Admiral Moon requested additional escort vessels. His request was denied. The reasoning was that this was an exercise in British coastal waters. German naval forces were not expected in the area. The risk was considered minimal. This was the second critical command failure. Moon knew the convoy was vulnerable. A single corvette could not protect 8 LSTs spread across several miles of ocean. If German forces attacked, the convoy would be defenseless. Moon's concerns were overruled by officers who prioritized schedule over security. At 2100 hours, on April 27th, 9 German E-boats departed Cherbourg, France. The boats were part of the 5th and 9th Schnellboot flotillas based in Normandy. The German designation was Schnellboot fast boat. The British called them E-boats for enemy boats. The vessels were approximately 115 feet long, displaced 100 tons, carried 40mm and 20mm guns, and were armed with 2 torpedoes each. Maximum speed was 42 knots. They were fast maneuverable and deadly. The E-boat's mission was to patrol the English Channel looking for Allied shipping. German intelligence had reported increased Allied naval activity around the Devon coast but had no specific information about Exercise Tiger. The E-boat commanders were looking for targets of opportunity. At approximately midnight, German radar operators detected the LST convoy 15 miles off the Devon coast. The convoy was running with minimal lights, but the large ships were visible on radar. The E-boats increased speed and closed to attack range. HMS Azalea was several miles ahead of the convoy, completely out of position to provide protection. The corvette's radar had detected contacts, but the operator misidentified them as friendly vessels. By the time the error was recognized, the E-boats were attacking. At 1:30 hours, the first torpedo hit LST 507. Ensign John Doyle, standing watch on the bridge, heard the explosion before he felt it. The ship shuddered. Metal screamed. Men started shouting. Doyle grabbed the intercom and called for the captain. Commander George Zetterland reached the bridge within seconds. He assessed the damage immediately. The torpedo had hit the starboard side amidships, penetrating the tank deck where soldiers were sleeping. Water was pouring in. The ship was listing to starboard. Power was failing. Zetterland gave the order to abandon ship at 01:45 hours, 15 minutes after the torpedo hit. The crew and embarked troops had 15 minutes to evacuate a ship carrying over 400 men. This was where inadequate training became fatal. American soldiers had been issued inflatable life belts, not life jackets. The belts were designed to be worn around the waist and inflated by pulling a cord. The soldiers had been given minimal instruction on how to use them. Most inflated the belts immediately and put them on incorrectly. The buoyancy was concentrated at the waist, which caused men to flip upside down in the water. Soldiers floated face down, unable to right themselves, and drowned within minutes. Others jumped into the water wearing full combat equipment. Rifles, packs, ammunition, helmets, everything they'd been issued for the landing exercise. The weight pulled them under immediately. Some soldiers refused to abandon ship because they couldn't swim. They stayed aboard until LST 507 sank at 02:30 hours, 1 hour after the torpedo hit. While LST 507 was sinking, the E-boats attacked again. At 2:04 hours, 2 torpedoes hit LST 531. The explosions tore the ship apart. LST 531 sank in 6 minutes. Over 400 men went into the water. Most were dead within 20 minutes from drowning, hypothermia, or injuries from the explosions. The water temperature in Lime Bay on April 28, 1944 was approximately 42 degrees Fahrenheit, 6 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, survival time is 30 to 90 minutes depending on physical condition. Soldiers wearing wet clothing and struggling in the water succumbed even faster. LST 289 was hit by a torpedo that failed to detonate. The torpedo struck the hull. penetrated several compartments and lodged in the ship without exploding. The LST continued toward Slapton Sands with an unexploded German torpedo embedded in her hull. The other LSTs scattered. Some tried to rescue survivors. Others fled at maximum speed. HMS Azalea finally arrived and began dropping depth charges, but the E-boats had already withdrawn. They had expended their torpedoes and were returning to Cherbourg. By 300 hours, the E-boat attack was over. 2 LSTs were sunk, 1 was damaged. Approximately 800 men were dead or dying in the water, and Exercise Tiger was supposed to continue. At 430 hours, Admiral Moon faced a decision. The attack had destroyed 2 ships and scattered the convoy. Hundreds of men were missing. The schedule called for the landing to begin at 0730 hours. Moon could abort the exercise, recover survivors, and postpone the landing, or he could proceed with the remaining LSTs and salvage what training value remained. Moon decided to continue. His reasoning was that D-Day could not be postponed because of casualties. Soldiers needed to experience landing under adverse conditions. The exercise had to proceed. This was the 3rd critical command failure. Moon prioritized training over rescue. Ships that could have been searching for survivors instead continued toward Slapton Sands. Men floating in the water were left to die while the exercise proceeded on schedule. The landing began at 0730 hours as planned. 6 LSTs beached at Slapton Sands. Troops disembarked under simulated combat conditions. Naval gunfire pounded the beach. Aircraft strafed targets inland. To observers on the beach, the exercise appeared successful. But the soldiers landing at Slapton Sands knew something had gone wrong. They'd heard explosions during the night. They'd seen ships on fire. They knew men were missing. The officers wouldn't tell them what had happened. At 0600 hours, naval gunfire support had begun as scheduled. The cruiser HMS Hawkins and several destroyers opened fire on targets inland from the beach. The fire plan called for bombardment to lift at 7:25 hours, 5 minutes before troops landed. At 7:21 hours, a communication failure occurred. The shore fire control party responsible for coordinating the bombardment lost radio contact with HMS Hawkins. The cruiser continued firing. At 0726 hours, the first wave of landing craft approached the beach. At 11:08 hours, shells from HMS Hawkins began landing on the beach where American troops were about to land. The error was immediately recognized, but stopping naval gunfire required multiple radio communications through several layers of command. By the time HMS Hawkins received the order to cease fire, approximately 300 shells had been fired. At least 30 landed among American troops on or approaching the beach. The casualties from this friendly fire incident remain classified. Estimates range from 50 to 200 killed or wounded. Bodies were collected quickly. Wounded were evacuated, and the exercise continued. By 1200 hours on April 28th, Exercise Tiger was officially complete. General Collins observed the landing from shore. He noted in his after-action report that the exercise had been valuable despite complications. The complications he referred to included 946 American servicemen dead. The exact breakdown was approximately 749 killed in the E-boat attack, approximately 200 killed or wounded by friendly fire during the naval bombardment, and additional casualties from drowning, hypothermia, and accidents during the landing. These numbers were immediately classified. Families were told their loved ones had died in training accidents. No details were provided. The bodies were buried in military cemeteries in England with minimal ceremony. The next of kin received standard notification letters that revealed nothing about how their sons, husbands, and fathers had actually died. The cover-up began immediately after the disaster. Eisenhower's headquarters issued orders that all information regarding Exercise Tiger was classified top secret. Officers involved were ordered not to discuss the incident. Enlisted men were threatened with court-martial if they revealed what had happened. The reasoning was operational security. If the Germans learned that American forces had suffered such heavy casualties during a training exercise, they might deduce that the Allies were planning to invade Normandy. The location of Exercise Tiger Devon coast was close to Normandy. The German intelligence might conclude that Slapton Sands was a rehearsal area for the actual invasion. Therefore, everything about Exercise Tiger had to remain secret. But there was another reason for the cover-up. The disaster revealed catastrophic failures in command communication and training. Admiral Moon had allowed a convoy to sail with inadequate escort. General Collins had proceeded with a live fire exercise despite knowing communication systems were inadequate. Training officers had failed to properly instruct soldiers on the use of life-saving equipment. Naval officers had failed to coordinate fire support with ground forces. The list of failures was extensive, embarrassing, and damaging to the reputations of senior officers. Several investigations were conducted in the weeks following Exercise Tiger. The investigations identified multiple contributing factors. Communication equipment was inadequate. SCR-300 radios used by shore-fire control parties had a range of only 3 miles in ideal conditions. In practice, range was often less than 1 mile. Communication with ships several miles offshore required relaying messages through multiple stations, introducing delays and increasing the probability of errors. The radio frequencies used by American forces were not properly coordinated with British forces. HMS Hawkins was operating on a different frequency than the American Shorefire Control Party. When the Americans lost contact with the cruiser, they had no backup method to communicate ceasefire orders. Identification. Friend or foe systems were primitive in 1944. IFF transponders existed, but they were unreliable. Allied ships and aircraft were supposed to transmit specific codes that would identify them as friendly. But the equipment failed frequently, batteries died. Operators forgot to activate the systems, and enemy forces sometimes captured IFF equipment and used it to confuse Allied forces. On the night of April 27 to 28, the LST convoy was transmitting IFF codes, but HMS Azalea's radar operator either didn't receive the codes or misinterpreted them. When E-boats appeared on radar, the operator couldn't definitively identify them as hostile. By the time visual identification was made, the attack had already begun. The investigations also revealed training failures. Soldiers from the 4th Infantry Division had received minimal instruction on amphibious operations. Most had never been on a ship before Exercise Tiger. They didn't know how to use life-saving equipment. They didn't understand abandoned ship procedures. They panicked when the attack began. Officers were supposed to have conducted training on these subjects, but time was limited and other priorities took precedence. Weapons training, physical conditioning, tactical drills all received more attention than what many officers considered unlikely scenarios. The assumption was that soldiers wouldn't need to abandon ship during a training exercise. The investigations identified another critical factor. The chain of command for Exercise Tiger was unclear. Admiral Moon commanded naval forces. General Collins commanded ground forces. But who had overall command? Who could abort the exercise if things went wrong? Who was responsible for ensuring adequate security? The command structure was a committee, multiple officers with overlapping responsibilities, and no single person with clear authority to make final decisions. When the E-boat attack occurred, no one had the authority to immediately recall the convoy or cancel the landing. Moon consulted with Collins. Collins consulted with higher headquarters. By the time decisions were made, men were already dead. The most damning finding was that the disaster was predictable. British intelligence had warned that German E-boats were active in the English Channel. Coastal radar stations had detected German naval activity near Cherbourg in the days before Exercise Tiger. The Admiralty had recommended postponing the exercise or providing additional escort vessels. The recommendations were overruled because the schedule for D-Day was non-negotiable. Training had to be completed by mid-May. Any delay would jeopardize the invasion. Therefore, risks were accepted. What made the cover-up particularly egregious was that the lessons from Exercise Tiger were not disseminated. The communication failures, training deficiencies, and command problems identified during the investigations were classified along with everything else about the disaster. Units preparing for D-Day were not informed about what had gone wrong at Slapton Sands. They made many of the same mistakes on June 6, 1944. At Omaha Beach, naval gunfire support failed to suppress German defenses, partly because communication between shore parties and ships offshore broke down repeatedly. At Utah Beach, landing craft became disorganized and landed troops in the wrong locations, partly because of the same navigation and coordination problems that had plagued Exercise Tiger. The difference was that on D-Day, the Germans were shooting back. The casualties from friendly fire and training deficiencies were obscured by casualties from enemy action. Admiral Don Moon never recovered from Exercise Tiger. He commanded naval forces at Utah Beach on D-Day and performed adequately, but he remained haunted by the disaster. In August 1944, Moon was given command of naval forces for Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. On August 5, 1944, Moon shot himself in his cabin aboard his flagship. He left no suicide note. His widow later stated that he had been under extreme stress and felt responsible for the deaths at Exercise Tiger. Moon was 52 years old when he died. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. His suicide was attributed to combat fatigue. The connection to Exercise Tiger was not publicly acknowledged until decades later. The cover-up of Exercise Tiger persisted for over 30 years. British and American governments maintained that the incident was classified for national security reasons. Families of the dead received no information beyond the initial notification that their loved ones had died in a training accident. In the 1970s, researchers began investigating Exercise Tiger. Documents were slowly declassified. Survivors began speaking publicly. The full scope of the disaster became known. In 1984, a memorial was erected at Slapton Sands, commemorating the American soldiers who died during Exercise Tiger. The memorial consists of a Sherman tank recovered from the beach mounted on a concrete plinth with a plaque listing the units involved. The dedication ceremony on November 12, 1984, was attended by survivors' families of the dead and military officials. It was the first public acknowledgement by the U.S. government that Exercise Tiger had occurred. The impact of Exercise Tiger on morale was significant but carefully managed. Soldiers who participated in the exercise and survived knew that hundreds of their comrades had died. They knew the deaths were caused partly by mistakes made by their own commanders. They knew the Navy had failed to protect them. They knew their training had been inadequate, but they were ordered not to talk about it. The combination of trauma, anger, and enforced silence created psychological stress that many carried for the rest of their lives. Some survivors refused to participate in D-Day, claiming illness or injury. Courts-martial records from May 1944 show an increase in desertions and refusals to obey orders among units that had participated in Exercise Tiger. The numbers were small, but they represented a breakdown in trust between soldiers and their commanders. For the majority of soldiers, Exercise Tiger reinforced their determination. They understood that the invasion of France would be even more dangerous than the training exercise. They knew men would die. They resolved to ensure those deaths meant something. On June 6, 1944, troops from the 4th Infantry Division landed at Utah Beach. They were the same units that had trained at Slapton Sands 6 weeks earlier. Many were survivors of Exercise Tiger. They landed under German fire, fought inland, and established the beachhead. Utah Beach was the most successful of the 5 D-Day landing beaches. American forces suffered approximately 197 casualties, far fewer than the 946 who had died at Slapton Sands. The success at Utah Beach vindicated some of the training conducted during Exercise Tiger. Soldiers knew how to exit landing craft, cross the beach, and assault fortified positions. Officers knew how to coordinate infantry and armor. Engineers knew how to clear obstacles. But the success came despite, not because of the command decisions that had led to disaster at Slapton Sands. The technological limitations that contributed to the disaster at Slapton Sands persisted throughout World War II. IFF systems remained unreliable. Radar could detect contacts, but often couldn't distinguish friendly from enemy aircraft or ships. Radio communications were subject to interference equipment failure and operator error. The fog of war, the confusion inherent in combat operations, guaranteed that mistakes would continue. Friendly fire incidents occurred repeatedly during the Normandy campaign. On June 7th, American fighters strafed American paratroopers near Sainte-Mère-Église, killing 35. On July 24th, American bombers dropped their ordnance short during Operation Cobra, killing 111 American soldiers, including Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer killed by friendly fire during the war. The bombings were caused by the same communication and coordination failures that had plagued Exercise Tiger. The analysis of friendly fire incidents during World War II identified common causal factors: inadequate communication equipment, Insufficient training. Poor coordination between different services. Army, Navy, Air Force. Unclear chains of command. Time pressure that forced commanders to proceed despite recognizing risks. Technological limitations. And fundamentally, the complexity of modern warfare exceeded the ability of human organizations to control all variables. Exercise. Tiger demonstrated all these factors simultaneously. It was a perfect storm of institutional failure. And because the disaster was covered up rather than studied, the lessons were not learned. The pattern repeated in subsequent conflicts. In Korea, friendly fire casualties accounted for approximately 15% of American combat deaths. In Vietnam, the percentage was similar. In the 1991 Gulf War, despite vastly improved technology, 35 of 146 American combat deaths were from friendly fire. The fog of war persists. The impact on families of exercise Tiger victims was devastating and prolonged. For decades, they knew only that their loved ones had died in a training accident in England. They received no details, no explanations, no accountability. Many suspected there was more to the story, but official records remained classified. When the truth finally emerged in the 1980s, many families felt betrayed. Their government had lied to them for 40 years. The soldiers had died not in combat against the enemy, but due to preventable mistakes by their own commanders. And then those mistakes had been covered up to protect the reputations of officers who went on to distinguished careers. The families received no apology, no compensation, no official acknowledgement beyond the memorial at Slapton Sands. In 2014, 70 years after Exercise Tiger, researchers identified remains of several soldiers killed during the disaster. The remains had been buried in England under incorrect names due to misidentification during the chaos after the attack. DNA testing allowed some families to finally learn the fate of their relatives. The identification process continues. The ultimate lesson of Exercise Tiger is that secrecy prevents learning. The disaster revealed critical weaknesses in amphibious operations, command structures, communication systems, and training. If those lessons had been disseminated immediately, subsequent operations might have been conducted with fewer casualties. Instead, the cover-up ensured that the same mistakes were repeated. Commanders prioritized institutional reputation over operational improvement. The result was more deaths, more failures, more cover-ups. The cycle continued for decades. Today, Exercise Tiger is studied at military staff colleges as a case study in how not to conduct operations. The disaster is used to teach the importance of realistic training, effective communication, clear command authority, and honest after-action analysis. The memorial at Slapton Sands stands as a reminder. 946 American servicemen died during a training exercise that was supposed to prepare them for combat. They died because commanders made decisions that prioritized schedules over safety, because equipment was inadequate, because training was insufficient, because coordination failed, and because when disaster struck, the institutional response was to hide the truth rather than learn from it. Their deaths were not heroic. They were preventable. And that might be the most important lesson of all.